We were walking down the street, wondering what to do now. It was about 8 o'clock in the morning, and it was freezing cold. We couldn't go to the student's house because we would have to explain the reason why we had been kicked out of the house. But we couldn't walk the streets endlessly, could we? I suggested going to the railway station, but then Stasik remembered that a few miles away from Barch, in a village, some organization had set aside a temporary hostel for Polish refugees. We went there, and by noon, frozen and hungry, we were already there. There were about 20 Poles of all ages living in the hostel. 8 was a former warehouse. We introduced ourselves, and 2 elderly Hungarian women immediately poured us hot coffee and gave us bread. All the inhabitants of the hostel were sitting around the only stove, and Stasik immediately joined the general conversation. I tried to collect my thoughts, but the picture of this morning kept coming back to me. Marischka's sleepy face when I kissed her for the last time, the white face of the old man pointing at the door. What will happen to my beloved? What will her parents do? What could I do for her? Obeying a sudden impulse, without saying anything to Stasik, I set off on my return journey and arrived at Barch in the afternoon. Thinking that Marischka must be at work, I went straight there. But after a long and incomprehensible explanation, I realized that she was not at work today. I had to go to her house. But I was probably seen from the window, and I heard the sound of a key turning in the door. No one answered my insistent knocking. I had to go back inside. "Where have you been, Stefan?" Stasik came at me. "There's a group that's going to cross the Drava tonight. Shall we join them?" "I'm just not up to it right now." "Are you coming?" "Yes, and you'd better come with us." I didn't even consider it necessary to answer. Stasik left. Left alone, I fell into a semi-conscious state. Marischka, her name kept going round and round in my head. I kept repeating it like a broken record. "We're leaving." Stasik's voice brought me out of my reverie. I didn't even notice when he came back. "I'm coming with you," I replied. The group of fugitives consisted of 10 men. Some had rucksacks on their backs, some had small sacks, and we had everything in our pockets. I didn't take part in the discussion of the plan of action and just followed the others into the night. The frosty night air was invigorating, and I felt myself being infected by the general mood. We had already left the city and were walking in a dense field, trampling a path through the deep snow. The moon was shining brightly in the sky, and the river bank was clearly visible in the distance. At the request of the group leader, we stopped, pelted ourselves with snow, and continued our way to the river. Twice we had to lie in the snow, waiting for Hungarian border patrols to pass. Finally, we got down to the river and crawled across the ice to the opposite bank. We resembled ghosts. In the light of the moon, 10 people were crawling at some distance from each other. A few tens of centimeters, stop. A few tens of centimeters more, stop again. When the moon disappeared behind the clouds, we cried. The Yugoslavian coast began to loom ahead. The most important moment came. The coast was heavily guarded, and we had to slip past the Yugoslav border guards unnoticed. If only we were lucky. Stasik and I crawled to the shore at the same time, and for a few minutes, listening, waited for the moon to disappear behind the clouds. I heard someone climb onto the shore and roll back onto the ice with curses. However, Stasik and I managed to climb up the embankment and roll down into Yugoslav territory. After a little breathing, I crawled through the deep snow. Stasik crawled beside me. We had covered about 100 meters when the silence was broken by a sharp shout. A beam of light flickered to our right. A couple of seconds later, we heard Polish speech and saw one of our group rise out of the snow and approach the Yugoslav border guards. We crawled forwards, away from the place. We stopped. We rested for a quarter of an hour, lying on our backs in the snow, and then continued on our way, keeping to the direction to the west. Of the 10 of us, there were only 3 left. Me, Stasik, and a man about my age who called himself Michael. Although I did not take part in working out the route, I assumed that we should find a road leading to Virovitica, then head in the direction of Jelova and get as close to Zagreb as possible. The goal, to get as far away from the border as possible before the Yugoslav police caught us. In the darkness, falling into deep snow, stumbling and falling, we quickly felt very tired. On the way we came across several country roads leading to villages. Smelling the strangers, dogs barked. We resisted the temptation to knock on the first house we came across and ask for food and a short rest. Who could guarantee that we would not be immediately handed over to the authorities and sent back to Hungary where we would be imprisoned? So without stopping, we went further and further away. The morning found us on our way. As if in slow motion, we could hardly move our feet and walked across the field. Houses appeared ahead. A dog barked angrily. We knocked on the door of the outermost house and entered. "We are Poles and we are very hungry," Stasik said to the man sitting on a stool. He looked at us and mumbled something indistinctly, then said to the woman standing at the cooker, "Give them some milk and bread." While the woman poured the milk and cut the bread, the man continued to stare at us. From Hungary?" He spoke Slovene, and we understood him. "Yes." "Are you going to fight?" "Yes." "Why do you want to do that?" Before we could explain, he continued, "I was a soldier too in World War I. What did you get out of it? Here, look." He turned round and we saw the scar across his face from forehead to chin and the empty left eye socket. War brings nothing good. And with a hearty spit on the floor, the man stood up heavily and walked out. I ran my eyes round the room. There was a bed in one corner with someone fiddling under a blanket. As I looked closer, I saw the head of an ancient old woman, wrinkled, with a hooked nose and toothless mouth. Two small children were peering out from behind her back, watching us with wide-open eyes. In another corner of the room, a calf was tied to a hook driven into the wall. Under the calf's feet there were chickens in the straw. Very poor people lived in this house. The landlady gave each of us a mug of warm milk and a piece of bread. I was terribly hungry, but I was so tired that during the meal I fell asleep for a few moments. Stasik and Michael were already asleep, leaning against each other, and I had nothing to lean against. Then I saw the old woman gesturing to me to lie down on the bed. I did not have to beg long. I lay down at her feet across the bed and instantly fell asleep. When I woke up, I didn't realize it at first. The old witch was grinning with her toothless mouth. At the other end of the bed, two children's faces were looking at me. A calf was roaring, and a soldier was leaning over me and pulling me by the arm. Behind his back was a rifle with a bayonet fixed. I rubbed my eyes, thinking I was dreaming, let my feet down from the bed, and got up. Then I saw Stasik and Mikhail sitting on the bench, rubbing their eyes and yawning. Apparently they too had decided that they had dreamt about the soldier. Then I realized what had happened. The Yugoslavs had found us. Where would they take us? To Zagreb or send us back to Hungary? The soldier, without explaining anything, took us out of the house, put us in a horse-drawn sleigh, and drove us to a small town a few miles from where we were sleeping so sweetly. At the police station there were already two of our group and several other Poles who, like us, had crossed the Drava during the night. We were all given something to eat, and then taken to the railway station and put into a wagon. A guard got into the carriage with us. "Where are they taking us?" we asked our guard. To Zagreb." "Hooray! You heard us, we're going to Zagreb," someone shouted. "You don't understand where they are taking you," the escort said, seeing our reaction. "What do you mean, where?" "In Zagreb you will be imprisoned for illegal border crossing." "No. For how long?" "Sometimes they put you in jail for a week, sometimes not for a few days. It depends on a lot of things." "Like what?" "Oh, how the prison authorities treat Poles. If it's good, you won't spend more than a day in jail, with good food. And if not, then?" How do you know that?" The guard laughed in response. "I take Poles to Zagreb by the dozens almost daily throughout the winter, so you don't have to doubt my words. Why are you so keen to leave home? Why are you wandering around the world by the thousands? Haven't you had enough war in your own country?" No one had any desire to take part in the argument. Some were already asleep. Some were preoccupied with their own thoughts. The guard made himself comfortable, unbuttoned his uniform and stretched his legs out into the passage. We arrived in Zagreb late in the afternoon, and the guard led us through the city. Casual pedestrians looked at our procession with curiosity. It was cold. A strong wind was blowing. We passed a nightclub where we could hear cheerful music and bursts of laughter. Women in evening toilets accompanied by men in dinner jackets gave us a careless glance and entered the club. What a bottomless chasm separates our worlds, I thought. We approached the prison. The gates opened and let in another group of hungry and frozen Poles. For 2 hours we set down on paper the details of the Yugoslav border crossing, Then our group of 11 was placed in a cell on the ground floor. There were already several people in the cell. 4 of them slept on bunks along the wall, the rest on the bare floor. To put it bluntly, the only light bulb hanging from the ceiling emanated this unhappy picture. We entered the cell, and the door closed behind us with a few turns of the key. We were in prison again. Stumbling over the bodies lying on the floor, we tried to find empty seats. We managed to do so. After we had settled down, we decided to ask the inhabitants of the cell where we had got to. There were only Poles in the cell, arrested, like us, for illegal border crossing. Some had been here for a week, some for only a day. "Why don't they let us go any further?" Michael asked. For the same reason as the Hungarians, came a voice from the floor. They respect the laws. They're afraid of provoking the Germans and their own bureaucracy. "How is the food here?" I asked, feeling a sucking hunger. "Hey, black coffee and bread. Every day. Nothing else." "They treat us like criminals," added the man sitting next to me. "The guards are normal people, but they're scared to death of their boss. He's a real bastard. Every morning he comes to check on us and demands that we stand at attention. Probably a fucking German, but in Slavic guise, and he's got a lot of time on his hands. Prison's full of Poles." "How do we get out of here?" Stasek asked. "If you can offer him a bribe, you'll be released tomorrow. If not, you'll wait on a general basis until it's your turn at the consulate. But it's a long story." We had many more questions, but there were disgruntled voice. "No. Talk tomorrow. You have plenty of time ahead of you. Everyone wants to sleep." There was a persistent smell of faces in the cell. In the corner on a small pedestal was a black bucket used for natural needs. Michael went to the corner to use the bucket for its intended purpose. "Can't you see?" Came an indignant voice. "It's filled to the brim." "But I can't take it anymore. I'm going to burst." "Hey, tie yourself in a knot and wait until morning," came the advice from the floor. "The bucket is emptied before the morning formation." Michael, along with others like him, had to endure until morning. They did not dare to disobey the advice of the old-timer. Sitting on the stone floor, leaning against each other, they slept intermittently. Their bodies got stiff, and about every half an hour someone could not stand it and change position, and, of course, woke up the others. Old floor, overflowing bladder, the snoring of fellow inmates, and to top it all off, lice. By the end of the night we were all itching. Finally, the agonizing night came to an end and morning came. It began with shouting guards, clanking keys, and carrying buckets full of filth, and then it was our turn. The 4 of us took the bucket out and used the toilet at the end of the corridor. "Hurry up, hurry up." The guards were pushing us. 1 minute each. "Very reminiscent of a Gestapo prison," commented the man standing next to me, "or a Soviet prison. Then they will demand that we sign a confession." We thought we would now be served breakfast, but we were disappointed. Next came formation and roll call. We lined up along the corridor. Guards stood on both sides. The warden appeared in a uniform with epaulettes with a sabre at his side and walked slowly along the line. He had the appearance of a general reviewing an army. Any complaints?" he asked, stopping in the center of the formation. "We are starving," shouted one. "There are 20 of us in one cell. We are treated like criminals." The warden walked silently along the line. When the stream of complaints had dried up, he came to the center again and, with his chin up, made a speech in reply. "Yes, you are starving. Yes, your cells are overcrowded. But it's all your own fault. No one asked you to come here. Are you being treated like criminals? You are criminals. You broke the law, and you should be punished. Any other questions?" "Yes," came a voice. "You son of a bitch." This phrase sounds the same in any Slavic language. The warden, while remaining outwardly unperturbed, nevertheless noticed the screamer. He walked slowly along the line and stopped in front of the man who had dared to insult him in the presence of his subordinates. The chief was clearly furious, but he knew how to keep his temper. Without saying anything, he slowly turned round and, ordering the guards to take us to our cells, left the corridor. That day we did not receive coffee and bread until the evening, and throughout the day the prison was filled with cries of protest. For the next 2 days and 2 nights, Poles who were constantly arriving were pushed into the cells. We could no longer breathe, and more people were coming in. We were still fed once a day, in the evening, The atmosphere became heated. But on the third morning our cell was opened by a smiling guard. Our supervisor. He'd been transferred. We immediately felt the change. Within 4 hours we received coffee and bread twice. The cells were not locked now. In the afternoon, the first groups of Poles were taken out of the prison in lorries. We did not know where they were being taken, but in any case it was better than being in prison. The group that Stasik, Michael and I were in came about midnight. A lorry took us to the railway station where we were put on a train. Over 100 people travelled on the journey, accompanied by 3 policemen. We were allowed to get off at stations and those who had money could buy newspapers and food. "Where are we going?" I asked one of the policemen. To the camp in Split." "N-R-A-A-I," I shouted. "To Split." "What are you so happy about, Stefan?" Miss Stasek asked. "I know Split very well. It is a port on the Adriatic Sea in Dalmatia. I've been there several times before the war. You have a bank account there, don't you, Stefan? Know any nightclub girls? Or do we have to protect you from pesky creditors?" Michael fantasized. "Most likely we'll be put in another stinking prison, and there won't be any girls and clubs." Stasek said gloomily. His predictions didn't come true. In Split, we were accommodated in a new, modern building belonging to the Jadranska Straza, the coastal defence units of Yugoslavia. On the ground floor, there was a huge gymnasium, where a large number of straw bunks were already waiting for us on the floor. Each of us was given a blanket, and we were free to use the toilet. During the day, we could walk around Split. 3 times a day, we were fed at the Catholic monastery, and were even given an extra portion of bread at dinner. The day we arrived in Split, an official from the Polish consulate from Zagreb arrived there as well. He explained to us that as a result of negotiations with the Yugoslav authorities, we were allowed to sail officially to Malta and unofficially to France on a Greek ship chartered especially for this purpose. However, Germany is pressurizing the Yugoslav government to intern Poles. This may be the cause of the delay. For 12 days we hung around aimlessly in the harbour, watching the ships depart. We even wanted to steal a fishing boat and sail to Malta at night. With the help of an acquaintance who I knew from my pre-war visits to Split, I managed to obtain nautical charts. From him, I also obtained the necessary information about the shipping channel. On the morning of the day we had planned for our operation, I was awakened by a loud shout. A large vessel has moored in the harbour, probably came to Split during the night. We rushed to the harbour, where indeed we saw a ship under the Greek flag with the home port of Piraeus. About 300 Poles that same night, 3 February 1940, were loaded on board the Greek ship, which arrived in Marseilles on 7 February. We were taken in French army lorries from Marseilles to the camp, where hundreds of Poles were being transported who were arriving in France every day. We were accommodated in barracks that were overcrowded beyond measure. There were times when only one camp bed with a straw mattress and a blanket for 3 people. The food was poor and irregular. The barracks were infested with lice. Attempts were made to form groups and units of us, under the command of a senior officer, but we were a motley collection. Among us were representatives of all ranks, from colonels to privates and civilians, who had no idea what a formation was or how to answer during roll call. The queue for food was like a millipede. Everyone moved their hands vigorously, trying to reach the most inaccessible parts of the body, to squash a particularly insolent louse that had set up a feast in a cherished place. For this reason, the formation, roll call, and singing of the national anthem, which required standing at attention, were not popular. We spent a fortnight in camp. Then the sergeants were distributed to various training centres scattered throughout France, and the officers were sent to Paris in the barracks Bessières. There I saw people in Polish uniform for the first time since September 1939. At the entrance to the barracks stood Polish sentries, and although they saluted our rather shabby, continuously scratching group, but tried to avert their eyes from the rags in which we were dressed. We formed up. A colonel in a perfectly fitting uniform with battle honours came out to us and began to make a speech. The longer he talked, the more annoyed he got. Finally, he couldn't stand it any longer and, interrupting half a word, asked, "Gentlemen, will you do me the favour to stand still while I speak?" "No, Mr. Colonel," said a voice. "What do you mean, no?" "We're being eaten by lice, Mr. Colonel." That was the end of the formation. We were ordered to undergo sanitation. We were taken by lorry to Sluis Hospital. We stripped naked and our clothes were taken to be steamed. I immersed myself in a bathtub whose water smelled disgustingly of chemicals. The bodies of slain enemies floated around. Then, taking a deep breath, I went under, and another batch of lice covered the surface of the water in a thin layer. Then I washed myself in a tub of plain water, without any disinfectants, and emerged into the world without the unwanted and evil inhabitants feasting on my body. "Isn't that wonderful?" remarked Stasik when we met in the changing room after the wash. On the way back, I noted that most of us were still scratching ourselves out of habit. Now that we looked like human beings, the army machine was working. We were assigned to barracks according to our membership in a particular branch of the army. Stasik and Michael got bunks in the infantry barracks. I shared a small room with the liaison officer. There were 2 beds made up with clean linen. Not far from our room there was a bathroom, clean towels, and a reading room where fresh newspapers were laid out and a radio set stood. We were each given a small amount of money to buy essentials. Having received the money, I went to the nearest metro station and, having bought a ticket, rode the trains for almost an hour. Just like that, without any particular purpose. I looked at well-dressed people, at beautiful women. They were looking at me too, but for a completely different reason. I was relaxed on the soft seat, and to all appearances, they were somewhat shocked not only by my behavior, but also by my extremely unpretentious appearance. Tattered ski boots, underwear treacherously peeking out from under my trousers. But I didn't care at all. I was rich. For the first time in many months I had money in my pocket. I was back in the civilized world. For some reason we imagined that on arrival in France we would immediately be issued uniforms, distributed among the Polish regiments being formed in France and sent to the front, preferably to the Maginot Line. When the Germans started their spring offensive, we would already be there. Sobering up came a few days later. We realized that it would take months, not days, to get a uniform and secure an assignment. The Polish government in exile had insufficient funds, and the Allies were slow to assist. There was a shortage of equipment, combat equipment, even rifles. Poles continued to go to France by the thousands, eager to take part in the war, but here they encountered the passivity of the leadership. We lived according to military regulations, but continued to wear civilian clothes. Formations, lectures and French lessons were organized mainly to fill the free time we had in abundance and to moderate our ardor a little. Every morning after breakfast, we looked at the list of new assignments and envied those whose names were on it. These lucky ones, under the pretext of saying goodbye to those who stayed in Paris, came to us to proudly show us their new uniforms. The Soviet-Finnish War began. The Finns were fighting Poland's oldest enemies while we led an idle life in France. Several thousand Polish volunteers, about half of them Polish officers from Paris, volunteered to go to Finland. My name was on the lists, and I waited with hope for the day when we would go to Finland. After many weeks of waiting, the Finnish consulate in Paris informed us that for political reasons Finland had to refuse our offer. Day after day followed day, and hopes of a speedy appointment melted away. Information leaked to us that France herself was suffering from a shortage of arms and therefore was unlikely to arm us. Some of the Poles sent to the regiments informed us that many units were still unarmed, and some had one old-style rifle for every few men. The Germans have attacked Belgium and Holland. Things must change now, we assured each other. At any moment we could be sent to the front, that's for sure. But nothing happened. The Germans swept through Belgium and Holland, invaded France and marched towards Paris, and we still wore civilian clothes, went to French lessons, took part in daily regiments, and all the rest of the time begged Polish and French dignitaries to give us uniforms and weapons and send us to the front. Alas, all was in vain. For the sole purpose of fighting against the Germans, we were all anxious to get to France. We believed in the invincibility of France and perhaps Britain. Psychologically, we were not prepared for the defeat of this country, for its defeat, but everything was coming to that. The end was near, but we refused to believe it, even when the mass flight from Paris began. When a unit of French liaison officers disappeared from the barracks, leaving only a few ordinaries who were busy emptying the wine cellars, we sprang into action. Having broken into the warehouses, we came out of them already wearing French uniforms with Polish eagles and Polish army insignia attached to them. Splitting into groups of 10, we searched for vehicles. Stasik and I were in one group. After circling a few streets, we came across a parked convoy of army trucks. The drivers were sipping wine in a nearby cafe. We climbed into the outermost lorry, I got behind the wheel and calmly drove the car out of the convoy. No one rushed after us. We drove round the town for a while and stopped. Well, what now? I asked my companions. Assassine rifles. We've got to get rifles. Where the hell are we going to get them? Where, indeed? We were completely different people, so we couldn't agree on anything. After much argument, we decided to leave Paris and go to Versailles, not far from where one of the Polish regiments was stationed. We hoped that they would help us with rifles. There had already been several air alerts in Paris, but the city had not been bombed. The roads were clogged with traffic, army lorries, private cars, vans and carts, packed with people. Suitcases and the obligatory French wine bottles slowly crept out of the city in a southerly direction. Every time an air raid was announced, all traffic would stop. People would lie down on the ground and in roadside ditches, covering their heads with their hands in anticipation of the bombs. After a while, the traffic was restored. The Versailles barracks were empty. We found only a few Poles picking up Polish uniforms in a ruined warehouse. Come and join us, they suggested. It did not take long to persuade us, and soon we exchanged the French uniforms we had found in the warehouse in Paris for Polish ones, but we still had no weapons. Evening came, and we decided to spend the night at Versailles. Fearing that there would be no hunters to steal our lorry, we spent the night in it, although we had beds and bedding at our disposal in the barracks. In the morning it became known that the Germans had broken through from the north and were advancing on Paris with a broad front. There was talk of a defence line on the Loire. We decided to go there. We scoured the depot for food and found some chocolate, army galettes and wine, then got into the car and joined the endless stream of traffic pouring out of Paris in a southerly direction. It felt more like we were standing than driving. The lorry stalled a little before reaching Chartres. It had run out of petrol. There was a terrible scream for a few minutes. There was a traffic jam. The drivers, having vented their accumulated irritation on us, dragged our lorry into a ditch. Traffic was restored. We could not refuel. Petrol was all over gold. The Germans were literally stepping on our heels. Under such circumstances, no driver would have agreed to share fuel. To Chartres, we walked along with thousands of people walking on both sides of the road. The city was in chaos. Residents left their homes, hastily packed the essentials, loaded onto any transport and joined the stream of refugees moving south. However, there were some who took the situation calmly and preferred to wait and see what would happen next. In Chartres, we first heard the French say to each other, "La guerre est finie." For us Poles, the war in France neither began nor ended. After spending several fruitless hours in search of some military command ready to take us in and provide us with arms, we spent the night in an empty house on the outskirts of Chartres. In the morning we awoke to hunger. By our good fortune, 2 owner's chickens had strayed into the kitchen garden, which we cooked and ate. After a little refreshment, we went out into the street. Through the open windows came patriotic appeals alternating with poorly disguised declarations of a German offensive. Refugees passing through the city said that the Germans were bypassing Paris and heading south. We had no choice but to join the stream of refugees again. At noon, between Chartres and Châteaudun, German fighter planes machine-gunned a string of vehicles and people. Many were killed. A quarter of an hour later, German things spiked through bombs haphazardly moving mass of people. When the planes flew away, we climbed out of the ditch in which we hid during the raid. The road was a living hell. Mangled bodies, mangled cars. The smell of blood was thick in the air. We climbed into a flower van. Everyone in it had. I got behind the wheel and we drove off. With the van groaning under the weight of 10 burly men, we made it to Fontana. We ran out of petrol again, and just as we were about to abandon the van, the axle of the car in front of us broke, and the car was pushed into a ditch. The passengers took their belongings and joined the stream of refugees, while we poured out the petrol left in the tank of the abandoned car. We had enough petrol to get us as far as Vendôme. From there, after a short argument, we decided to head westwards to La Fleche, Angers and on to Nantes. I was sure that the Polish government was in exile in Angers, and I believed that we would get the necessary help there. If the government had left Angers, I heard that Polish ships often called there, and we could get food from them. At that time, we had not yet thought of going to England. From Vendôme, we travelled to La Fleche. On the way, we filled up with petrol. However, the petrol station owners were not very enthusiastic about filling our van's petrol tank. On the LA Fleet to Angers section, traffic was often interrupted by air raids. It was in Angers that we first recognized the possibility of a complete defeat of France and the necessity of going to England. The Polish offices had already evacuated. Only a few junior clerks remained in Angers. "Where has everyone gone?" we asked. "I suppose they are in the harbour." "They have gone to England," replied the official. "Are there any Polish ships in Nantes?" I asked. There were, but they were due to sail today. You better try to get to Bordeaux. According to the latest reports, there are 2 Polish cargo ships there. We asked him if he could help us with money, arms and food to get us to Bordeaux. "Alas, there is nothing we can do to help you. Use your own ingenuity. The French won't help you either. Most of them don't seem too pleased with our presence in their country. They somehow think the Germans will help us. We're going to leave here too. We'll be heading south." "What's the latest news on the German offensive?" "We haven't received any recent news. About an hour ago we got a call from Le Mans saying German tanks had entered the town. That's incredible. They couldn't have got that far. If that's the case, they'll be here by tomorrow at the latest." "Don't you have any weapons?" "Alas, not even a revolver." "Do you know of any military unit where we could get weapons?" I asked. "I would hate to fall into German hands again. There's a French regiment a few miles south of here. Try to get arms there." We went to the place indicated, but there was no one there who would take the responsibility of giving us weapons. It was explained to us that a license was required. For an hour we tried to persuade the French, but it was all in vain. In the evening a French major appeared and ordered us to be arrested. We had illegally taken possession of a French lorry. We had no papers. So he reasoned. We were deserters. We were locked up in a barracks with a sentry outside. We were so tired during these days that we fell asleep at once. In the morning we began to drum on the door, demanding to be fed. There was no response. We started banging and shouting again, but no one answered outside. When we broke down the door, we found that there was no one in the barracks. A white flag was flying on the flagpole. A few locals were watching us from the gate, and we asked them what had happened. "The Germans are already in Angers. You better get out of here. We do not want les Saboches to shoot us just because les Polonais are in the barracks." During the time we were away, the lorry disappeared without a trace. There was a bunch of keys hanging in the guardroom, and we began to open all the barracks in search of weapons. We were lucky. In one of the barracks we found several hundred rifles and about a dozen light machine guns. All the weapons were still in Greece. I chose the machine gun. Stasik filled his and my pockets with ammunition. The others took the rifles. "Let's test the weapons in action," Stasik suggested. We loaded the machine gun and Stasik fired a machine gun burst. From the street came the stomping of running feet and loud shouts. Les Boches." We laughed, not because we had managed to sow panic among the French, but because the machine gun was in perfect working order. At last we had a weapon. After a short meeting, we decided to move immediately southwards through Brisouille and Niort to Bordeaux, hoping to get some transport on the way. The streets were deserted. We walked through the town with rifles on our shoulders, and people, seeing our approach, scattered in a hurry. They think we're Germans. Good. The longer they won't dare shoot at us. "We need a lorry. It's no use even trying to walk to Bordeaux," said Stasik. We walked along the streets until we came upon a lorry parked outside a shop, full of baskets of vegetables. Stasik entered the shop and said in French that we needed their lorry. When we arrived, 3 men in the shop raised their hands. One immediately replied, "Jawohl." "On the street stands your lorry," Stasik continued. "Your J-hole." "Temitit." "Jawohl. But it's got baskets in it. Can you unload them?" "Your Javem, J-hole." The men immediately went outside and began hastily unloading the lorry. I noticed that one of them was studying us intently. Suddenly he threw the basket on the ground and shouted, "This is not bodies, it's Polonais." Now the others put down their baskets and stared at us in amazement. They unleashed a terrible torrent of curses on us. More Frenchmen came out of nowhere and began to insult us in every possible way. "Stefan, hurry up and start the car," shouted Stasik. "Everyone into the lorry, hurry up. We have to leave quickly." I went to the driver's cabin and then I saw that one of the Frenchmen took out a knife and was going to slash the tires. Stasik shot in the air. Everyone scattered. I jumped into the cab, started the car and drove away from the shop. We had to get on the road going south, and we wandered around the city for a while, panicking the French, until we got in the right direction. We had a map with us and realized we were going to Brisouille. After a few kilometers, we stopped to discuss the way forward. We were terribly hungry, and the only things left in the lorry were lettuce and cabbage. Noticing a farm from the road, we decided to buy some food there. I pulled off the road and realized that my clutch wasn't working. All I had in the lorry was a spanner and a screwdriver. We had to disassemble the gearbox, and that took us most of the day. Meanwhile, the traffic on the road had increased. If in the morning there were only a few cars passing by, now there was a dense stream of lorries, cars, horse-drawn carts. In the afternoon, the traffic gradually subsided and the road became empty. We had repaired the lorry and could get down to the business of finding food. We ventured towards the farm, but a young Frenchman shouted loudly as we approached. "Get out of here. The sooner the better. I don't need you to find Polonaise on me. Get out and quick." We couldn't get enough of the salad, but we chewed it and discussed our plan of action. The road had emptied. Not a single car had passed in the half an hour we had been sitting on the grass eating salad. "I don't like all this," said one of the companions. "It's too quiet." "What do you mean?" "The road is deserted. Not a single refugee in sight." "I don't like it," he repeated. "Maybe they've all passed," suggested the other, "or decided to stay. I'm sure that if the Germans were around, the road would be jammed with thousands of refugees." "And you don't hear any shots," added Stasik. "I don't think the Germans are 30 kilometers away. What do you think?" We all agreed and continued to stuff our bellies with salad to drown out the hunger that haunted us. "What's that over there?" Pointing to the crossroads, someone asked. We looked in that direction. "It's a French reconnaissance vehicle, one of us determined. Apparently they are setting up a checkpoint. Let's get going before they block traffic." "Right, let's go." I'm back behind the wheel. Stasik and another man climbed into the cab and the rest of us got in the back. Our tension increased as we approached the crossroads. What if they tried to arrest us? What would we do? Stasik asked. "Hey, they don't even look in our direction." The reconnaissance vehicle was standing under a tree at the crossroads. I slowly drove up and stopped, expecting the French to get out of the car and ask us questions. If we drove past, I reasoned, they would suspect something wrong and might open fire. But no one got out of the car. So I started the engine and was just about to move off when a uniformed man with a machine gun on his chest got out of the car. "Halt, wohin gehen Sie?" he shouted. "Germans," shouted Stasik. "Germans." Seeing 3 more soldiers on the road, the others shouted. I, of course, should have dashed forward, but instead I turned the truck around and drove it back to where we had just come from. We had only gone about 100 meters when the first shots rang out. The people in the back of the truck started shooting back. We were traveling in a cloud of dust, so I could not see in the mirror if the Germans were following us. With my foot on the accelerator pedal, I was speeding along when I heard Stasik's voice. "There's something on the road ahead." Probably another German car, I thought, and turning onto the road leading to the farm where we had been greeted so unkindly a few hours before, I drove into the yard and braked sharply. "The barn. I'm going into the barn, Stasik. Open the doors." Stasik didn't move, leaning heavily on me. "I've been wounded, Stefan. I'm wounded." His nose and left ear were bleeding. Someone opened the door of the barn and I drove inside. The door was closed immediately. "Oh, the Germans might not have seen us turn towards the farm," a voice said. "But if they did see us, I'm not going back to prison." Stasik was slumped in the seat when I got out of the cab. His hands were still clutching the machine gun. I gently unclenched his fingers and picked up the machine gun. Come here. It's a good view from here," I heard as I looked around for a good place for leaving the machine gun behind. I went back to the cockpit to pull ammunition out of Stasik's pockets. Then we broke a board out of the barn door, and now there was a perfect view of the whole yard and the road leading to the farm. My mind was a complete mess. Only by the trembling of my hands did I realize that I was badly frightened, but I did not think about what might happen to us at any moment. I only thought of one thing: Stasik was dead. What would I tell his parents when I returned? I was so anxious about this question, as if I was going to see them in a few days. What would I tell them? A noise in the courtyard made me wake up. I saw the young Frenchman who had chased us off the farm that morning. He was shouting angrily at an older man, probably my father. I knew almost no French and didn't understand what the argument was about. What are they saying? I asked my neighbour. Do you understand? Yes. The young one wants us off the farm, he replied. His father insists we stay. A moaning sound distracted my attention. The moan grew louder and louder. Dying. I'm dying. It couldn't be Stasik, he's dead. So who is it? Just then we heard a noise and a reconnaissance car appeared on the road leading to the farm, which drove into the yard and stopped in front of the arguing men. The driver stayed in the car, and the 3 men with automatic rifles jumped out. The main thing is to stay calm, my neighbour whispered. They could get away. The French raised their hands in the air. Wo sein Soldaten? Asked the German. I'm dying, came the voice again, and someone put his hand over the dying man's mouth. Wo geht der Soldaten? The German repeated his question. The French obviously did not know German, and the German repeated the question in French. They took that road, said the father, pointing in the direction of the Pont de Sea. They took that road. The son shouted at the same time as the father, pointing towards the crossroads. The German looked at the 2 hands pointing opposite directions and laughed. At the same time, the other 2 Germans scrutinized the yard and noticed the tracks of our lorry leading to the barn. There they are, shouted one of them, pointing in our direction. Then a German standing next to the Frenchman fired a machine gun burst, killing father and son. I pulled the trigger, and 3 of the Germans fell to the ground dead. I shot the 4th when he tried to turn the car round and drive away from the farm. We sat in the barn for about 10 minutes waiting for the other Germans to arrive, but all was quiet. Suddenly the silence was broken by the scream of an old woman running out of the house. Bending over the body of the old Frenchman, she tried to lift him up, but it was beyond her strength. One of my companions jumped out of the barn to help the old woman. She attacked him with curses. All we understood from her words was that we had to get out of here. He'd still be alive if you hadn't come. He'd still be alive. She screamed, sitting next to her husband's body, and burst into tears. What are we going to do? Someone's voice rang out. Lindsay's and the floor of the cabin were drenched with Stashek's blood. His face had turned grey and his open mouth still seemed to be saying, I've been wounded, Stefan, I'm wounded. Someone opened the opposite door of the cabin. Let's bury him, Stefan, and then try to get out of here. Seeing me hesitate, he said irritably, Come on, help. Or do you want to die too? The Germans won't want to take us prisoner when they see their own in the courtyard. Come on, help me. We lifted Stasik's body and carried it behind the barn. There were already several men digging a grave with shovels they found in the yard. 2 more of our men had died. One was the one who, saving his own skins, had his mouth clamped shut with his hand as he mumbled his dying words. The other, it was explained to me, had been killed in a frantic race down the road as we raced towards the farm. The grave was not yet ready when, through the clanking of jerry cans that one of my companions was hauling from the German car to our lorry, a short machine gun burst reached us. Then another, a third. Run, hurry. We can't leave them here. I protested. I have to bury Stasik. We escaped from Poland together and got to France. I must bury him. You'll lie next to him if you don't leave here at once. I can't leave him, I repeated, but my voice was drowned out by the noise of the aeroplanes flying overhead. Then the gunfire came again. No, Stefan, come on. We're getting away? I don't know whether I was crying at that moment or swearing foully, whether I swore revenge or kept silent. I remember that I put Stashek to sleep with his mouth still open. Flies were swarming over him, so I took off my uniform and covered his body. The dog came running up and, smelling the dead, ran away, howling longingly and tucking his tail. She looked round a couple of times on the run. I went back to the barn. Many years later, after the war, I travelled to France and tried to find the farm where I had buried Stasik. From memory, I found the road where I thought we had travelled south. I went round several farms asking lots of questions. It was all to no avail. Many farms had been burned or destroyed. Some had been taken over by other people. My 2-day wanderings around the neighborhood ended with an arrest. Someone had reported to the police that a strange it appeared walking around and questioning the surrounding farmers. The French police officers showed the utmost courtesy and understanding, but unfortunately could not help me in any way. After the war, I wrote to Stasik's parents in Poland. The letter came back with a note that there were no survivors. It turned out that Stasik's grandmother was Jewish, and the whole family was burned in the ovens of Auschwitz. The war killed 6 million Poles, and Stasik's family was among them. But someone buried Stasik under my name. The uniform I covered my friend with had my papers in it. They were sent to the Red Cross, which in turn informed my family that I had been killed and buried in France. The location of the grave was unknown. This was one of the 2 reports of my death that my family received. The barn door was open. In the back on the straw sat 4 of our men with rifles. 2 in the driver's cab were knocking out the remains of the front window to make it more convenient to fire the machine gun. I got behind the wheel, turned round and drove out of the yard. There was still no movement on the road. I pressed the accelerator pedal. It's like you go crazy when you get behind the wheel. We could fly out of the cab, screamed my companions. As we pulled onto the main road, we could see an air battle going on in the sky to the north. The wind carried to us the muffled sounds of explosions. I drove the car towards the junction. We sped past the unfortunate spot and sped on without seeing anyone on the road. Finally, a small village appeared ahead. At our appearance, a few of the locals scattered. There were no Germans, and no one shot at us. We never had to use guns again in France. After the encounter with the Germans, we waited for another encounter with them, assuming that they had moved further south. In addition, we expected to run into the French defence line, but after passing through several villages and not encountering a single vehicle, not so much a car, not even a cart, on the road, we entered Breswaya. When we stopped in the square, several people ran up to the car. They wanted to know if we had seen the Germans and how far they were from their town. We told them about our adventures. How many were there? Nadius, 4. Just 4. And you escaped? We killed them first. Bayan 31. Did they kill any of your men? Yes, 3 of us and 2 Frenchmen. GSS la guerre, mais elle est finie et traiteur. The day was coming to an end, and only now we felt very hungry. Do you have any money? Asked one of the Frenchmen. We had nearly 50 francs in all. He took us into his shop and cut off a few pieces of sausage and bread. SS Steve S.A. Polona? Yes. Do you realize what you've brought upon us? We're fighting a war for your Danzig and the Polish corridor, and what has it led to? Les botches in Paris. One should never fight for other nations. We didn't argue with him. We handed over the money, took bread and sausage, and, just leaving the city, stopped for a bite to eat. Chapter 15. The next day, following a column of refugees, you entered Bordeaux. Besides the French, English, and Poles, the city was flooded with refugees of all nationalities. People sat in the streets, squares, parks, and on the steps of staircases. At the open windows stood crowds of people listening to the latest news. France had capitulated. Some cried, some seemed relieved. La guerre est finie, they said, sipping wine at a table in a sidewalk cafe. It's all clear with them, but what do we do? We asked each other. Only England is at war now. But we can't cross the Channel. That's up to you, Captain, my companions told me. Take us to a vessel, anything from a boat to a line ship that will take us across. I had been to Bordeaux many times before the war, and knew the port decently well. We left the lorry. The Frenchman immediately took possession of it as soon as we had moved a decent distance away, and, taking our weapons, set off through the town to the harbour. There were several ships at the wharves and in the roadstead. I searched with my eyes for the Polish flag, but found no vessel bearing our flag. We learnt that there were English and American ships in the port, but the Americans took only citizens of their own country on board. The owner of a small Dutch coaster agreed to take us with the only requirement that we get exit visas. Air raid signals sounded and German planes appeared over the city. Without dropping any bombs, they kept their course to the sea. They are mining the mouth of the river to lock ships in the harbour, a French docker explained to us. Are there any Polish ships in the harbour? I asked him. Yesterday there were 2 ships in the harbour. One came in at high tide in the evening, and the other was unloading today. They brought peanuts, but who needs peanuts now? I think they'll try to leave this afternoon at low tide. They may have already sailed. We rushed to the docker's quay. USL Cargo Polonaise. We asked the first docker we saw out of breath. Parti, Eilis Layback 37. Pointing to a small cargo ship, slowly gliding towards the exit from the dock, he replied. Damn it, they're late. Damn them to hell, was the heartfelt response from the quay. When we turned round, we saw a group of Poles, as upset as we were. I realized that the ship had to pass through 2 more locks before it could enter the river. Run, hurry, we'll catch up with them at the lock, I shouted excitedly. The ship was already entering the first lock, and we ran headlong, jumping over some crates, mooring ropes and anchor chains, dodging cranes lifting and lowering cargo. When we got there, the ship was against the wall, waiting for the water to rise in the lock. There was no space on deck. Hundreds of people were lying, standing and sitting leaning against the side, and even in lifeboats. I jumped on deck, and after waiting for the mooring to finish, went up to the captain's bridge. Mr. Captain, there are 7 of us. Could you take us to England? Are all 7 of us Poles? Yes, all Poles. Hey, I've got over 400 men on board, and the lifeboats are designed for 40. The French said they wouldn't let me out if I took anyone but the crew. Did you see what's happening on deck? Yes, Mr. Captain. Then you have better eyesight than I do. I see nothing, he laughed. That's how I'll answer the French if they want to ask me questions. He looked at me intently and asked, Could I not have seen you before? Yes, Captain. Before the war I went with you several times to Luleå 3080. That's right, I remember now. You can be useful. Tell your friends to jump on board and enjoy the facilities. He laughed. I turned to leave when he said after me, And bring your rifles, you may need them. There are no weapons on board. I jumped down onto the quay, but apart from a few Frenchmen scrutinizing me, I saw no one. Where the hell are they? What a time for a stroll. My attention was attracted by a whistle from the deck. My mates were already on board. We assumed that the captain would agree to take us, they said, smiling. No one even noticed how we were on deck. The airlock filled. The ship gave the moorings and began to move slowly towards the exit. At that moment there was a sharp squeal of brakes, and a man and a woman with 2 small children jumped out of the car. Are you going to England? Shouted the man. Yes. We're English. Take us aboard, he asked, looking up at the captain's bridge. Probably receiving a favourable answer, he handed the children one by one onto the deck. The children were followed by his wife. The ship was moving, and the man managed to throw only 2 suitcases of all the luggage on deck and jump in himself. It's all because of that damned car, the man said without addressing anyone in particular. But you made it, I said. Do you speak English? He wondered. Where are you going? God, that's a stupid question. I'm sorry, he added with a laugh. His wife looked at the suitcases in confusion. You've left the most important things behind, darling, she grumbled. My whole wardrobe is gone. I'm sorry, darling. I didn't have much time. We slowly waded out into the river, turned around and swam to the mouth of the river, which was over 90 kilometres away. We were overtaken by several refugee boats. On the wharves, in the streets stretching along the river, we saw crowds of people stream around long lines of cars, bringing thousands of refugees from the north. Now that they had learned of France's surrender, they were no longer anxious to go anywhere. Perhaps they had even lost their fear of the Germans. Years of occupation awaited them. We who were leaving France had a different attitude to its defeat. We were going to a country that most of us had only hearsay about. We were sailing into the unknown. The rest of the day, as the ship moved slowly towards the mouth of the Garonne, was spent compiling the passenger list. In all, there were 417 passengers and 32 members of the ship's crew on board. More than half of the refugees were Poles. Second in number was a group of 6, and the rest were Dutch, Belgians, and Frenchmen. Then there was an English family who got on the ship at the last moment. Women and children were placed in cabins, and men occupied not only the decks, but also all the nooks and crannies. There was no problem with fresh water. The ship had plenty of it, but food was much worse. The ship was coming back with a cargo several hundred tons of peanuts in the holds, which the French dockers refused to unload. We were told that we could eat the peanuts as much as we liked. Pretty soon it became clear that the two lavatories could not satisfy the needs of all the people on board, and a special place was set aside for the men. About 10 o'clock in the evening we anchored south of Rouillan, at the mouth of the Garonne. The French pilot refused to accompany us further, saying that the estuary was mined, and he was not going to commit suicide. The sailors who had brought him ashore in one of the lifeboats returned with the news that German motorized units had already appeared in Rouillan. "If they use the artillery, we're dead," muttered someone on deck. "What does the captain think about it?" I asked one of the crew. "He wants to wait for the morning tide. There's no point in trying to get through at night without a pilot. We'll sail in the morning. Maybe we can get into the fairway with a big ship," and he pointed to a large liner anchored a few cable meters away. I stuffed my pockets with nuts, found a warm spot near the engine room, and fell asleep. The night was cold, but thanks to the warm air coming through the grill, I didn't freeze. I awoke several times during the night and saw that the stars were changing their position in the sky. The ship swayed. The water was gradually coming in. Twice during the night there were machine gun bursts from the northern shore. Towards morning low-flying aeroplanes appeared in the sky, but in the darkness I could not make out their identifying marks. Then I was awakened by a woman's voice complaining of the cold. "It's warm in here," I said. "Lie down next to me." She lay down beside me, and without opening my eyes I put my arms around her, held her close to me, and we fell asleep. A few hours later I was awakened by the shouting from the bridge and the clatter of men running on deck. It was morning, and apparently the ship was about to leave anchor. I wanted to get up, but the woman was still asleep, and I felt sorry to wake her. I looked into her face and laughed. She had covered her eyes with her feathered hat, and the lower part of her face, her white blouse and her elegant suit were covered with a layer of soot that had been flying from the chimney all night. My laughter woke the woman. She sat up and looked at me with a displeased leezed. "What made you laugh so much?" "Nothing in particular." "I just looked at you, that's all," I replied. "Were you cleaning the chimney at night?" "What makes you think that? If anyone was cleaning the chimney, it was you." At these words she took out a small mirror from her pocket. "Here, take a look." I looked into the mirror and laughed. "Now it's your turn," I said, holding out the mirror to the woman. "What a horror." She cried out, covered her face with her hands, and moaned. A sailor from the engine room was passing by with a pile of clean rags. I asked him for some rags and, ordering the woman to sit still, wiped the soot from her face. "You know, you're very pretty," I said. "I wish I had known that before." "Unfortunately, I can't say the same," she retorted. She still had a few black spots on her face, and those spots, along with her angry expression and ridiculous hat, made me laugh again. "I hate you," she declared, moving further away. "I'm sorry, but I can't help myself. You're so funny." "Nasty ignoramus," she shouted. You black monkey, that's what you are." "My name is Stefan, and may I know the name of the lady?" I asked with pretense of formality. "I won't tell you. But you just have to tell me your name. After all, we had spent most of the night together, and in full view of everyone. I'm very cold. I must say, there are several more nights to come, and just as cold." "I wouldn't come near you if I was dying of cold," she said, making an attempt to stand up. It wasn't that easy. She had high-heeled shoes, and one heel was stuck in the bars. She took her foot out, tried to pull the heel out, and then the shoe fell into the engine room. "I don't have any more shoes. This is the only pair. Please retrieve the shoe." I rescued the fallen shoe, and we made peace over a breakfast of water and peanuts. Her name was Galina. She's a singer. She's a soprano, and she sang in France. Like us, she had escaped without belongings other than the ones she was wearing. Meanwhile, the ship was hoisting anchor and travelling slowly towards the mouth of the river. The captain, knowing that we had a machine gun, asked us to take position on the spar deck 39. At the stern, the bosun and some refugees were setting up a wooden model, in colour and appearance resembling a 4-inch gun. The gun crew was stationed beside the mock-up. "Maybe we can fool the Germans," said the captain with a chuckle. "One for fresh water, one for food for the children, and one for the 2 lavatories on board." For my place where I lay down with my machine gun, I had a perfect view. I could see our ship, Both banks of the Garonne, several vessels astern, and ahead, about 800 meters from us, a huge liner. If the Germans have really entered the Ruelen, I thought, they will certainly shell us, though their main target will probably be the liner. The mouth of the river is mined, and it would be very difficult for us to pass without a local pilot. Besides, the Luftwaffe are unlikely to leave ships leaving Bordeaux alone. I looked at the liner ahead and suddenly saw a column of water rise into the sky at its side, facing the harbour. A moment later we heard the sound of an underwater explosion. The liner's been hit by a mine. "Raise anchor, full astern," shouted the captain. The ship shook like a fever. The anchor chain rattled and the anchor appeared on the surface. It was what was happening on the deck of the liner. It was too far away. I was informed from the captain's bridge that there was no movement on deck. After about 10 minutes we saw the liner tilt slightly to port. Gradually the roll increased. Apparently the engine room was still running, and the liner was being slowly drifted towards the mouth of the river where it ran aground. Lifeboats were launched from the deck and swam towards the shore. Then the liner spun round and almost blocked the fairway. Damn it, we seemed to have fallen into a trap. Cursed someone on the bridge. But the tide shook the liner and pulled it off the shoal and slowly dragged it back towards Bordeaux. But then another mine exploded beneath her, and the liner went down fast. Not more than an hour had elapsed since the first explosion, and now the liner rested forever on the sandbank. On our ship, the passengers had not yet fully realized what had happened. There were still queues on deck. Some were chewing nuts. Some were sleeping. Women were making sure their children didn't fall overboard. Some wondered why we were standing. It was only on the captain's bridge that the atmosphere was tense. The captain sent the steward to invite all the mates to the bridge to discuss the situation with them. You all know that the canal is mined. You realize that the mines will not disappear if we stay here until doomsday. The Germans can blow us to pieces if they use artillery. If we want to get to England, we'll have to take risks. What are your suggestions? Let's wait for the other ship and go in her wake. We could do that, nodded the captain. But if we don't get away with this tide, we shall never get away. We can drain the fresh water from the tanks overboard and thus lighten the ship. It's already being done, said the chief engineer. What other suggestions? Asked the captain, but there were no further suggestions. All right, we'll wait an hour and take our chances. If we hit a mine, I'll try to go ashore to give the men a chance to escape. Steward, bottle and glasses. It's been an hour. All the ships astern of us remained at anchor. 2 motorboats came off Rouen, one headed for the sunken liner, the other for us. He circled near us and returned to Rouen. The sun had risen above the horizon. It was noticeably warmer. The captain took off his tunic and rolled up his shirt sleeves. 5 minutes after the command raise anchor, the first mate signalled that the command had been carried out. The engine room telegraph rang out and our vessel moved forward, gently swaying. We approached the narrowest point of the fairway, marked by 2 buoys. The vessel was now just opposite a half-sunken liner lying on a sandbank, the captain holding with one hand the telegraph tube connecting him with the engine room, and with the other grasping the pile driver, turned his eyes from one cormorant to the other. Sweat was streaming down his face from the exertion, and in some places his shirt was drenched with sweat. He was clearly giving orders to the helmsman. Nod as a sigh. 5 degrees left rudder. There's 5 degrees left rudder. Hold. Yea, hold. Hold it. I got it. Noting 3 more degrees left rudder. Nurse 3 degrees left. Hold on. I got a hold. Way to go. Way to go. And on deck there was an atmosphere of lively merriment. A little girl was running. A boy was catching up with her, but he suddenly cried, dropping a toy overboard. A few women gently bent over the baby, and he answered them with a smile. No, keep it up. I heard the captain's command. Aye, keep it up, repeated the helmsman. In the starboard corridor at the bridge, the second mate of the captain, pale and concentrated, was staring through binoculars. Beside him stood the second helmsman, relieved from watch, his gaze fixed on the bow of the ship. Turning round, he caught my eye and winked. I winked back. We passed the mined liner. 2 rows of boys appeared in front of us, running up to the navigation channel out to sea. Way to go. Way to go. I thought the helmsman's voice sounded more confident than before. Hold the line. Aye, aye. Aye, hold the line. As we approached, the cormorants sitting on the buoys rose heavily into the air, and then, as soon as we passed the place they favoured, they lowered again. A flock of flying fish, which flew up from under the bow of the ship, disappeared under the water and after a while appeared far ahead. There was a complete calm. The mirror-like smoothness of the water was disturbed only by the light ripples created by the bobbing buoys. The captain's shirt was soaked through from the exertion, and he had no time to wipe the sweat from his face. Down on the deck a few boys were playing sailors. One tried to climb up the gangway, but another had managed to grab his leg and was now pulling him down. The queue for the toilets was not diminishing, and this despite the enclosure built on deck for the men. Many were still happily nibbling on peanuts, and from time to time ran to scoop up another portion of peanuts. The ship slowly moved forward. When the last pair of boys were astern, the capital gave the command stop, and then full ahead, we were out to sea. The minefield remained overboard. We sailed out into the Bay of Biscay. Chapter 16. The rest of the journey to England went normally, without much incident. Several times an unmarked aeroplane flew over us, but, probably at the sight of our formidable wooden mock-up, preferred not to take any risks. Or maybe we were just lucky. The faster ships that came after us from Bordeaux and caught up with us at sea were less fortunate. One was torpedoed and the other bombed. We caught the distress signals they sent. It cannot be said that life on the ship on this 4-day voyage was very pleasant. Only the children received food. The rest of us ate nuts and had tea once a day. Leaving a small supply, fresh water was poured overboard to make it easier for the ship to move through the mined passage. The coal was running low, and volunteers from among the passengers formed a chain and passed the nuts from the hold to the engine room, where they were added to the coal and thrown into the furnace. The ship smelled of roasted nuts. Fortunately, the weather was fine, and all but the children and a few women slept on deck. In the morning we woke up black with soot and with a stiffness in every joint. There was only one radio operator on the ship, and we took turns on watch to keep a round-the-clock watch on the airwaves. While I was on watch between 0 and 6 o'clock in the morning, Galena slept in a chaise longue, which I had asked the captain to buy for her. We never quarrelled again. On 26 July 1940 our ship, having taken on board an English pilot, entered the harbour of Falmouth. The coast of England looked quite different from what we had imagined. Not a single warship. We had expected the English to be vigilant in guarding their frontiers, fearing a German invasion. No matter how hard we looked, we couldn't find even a trace of coastal artillery. The cunning British must have camouflaged the guns so well that they cannot be seen from the sea, suggested one of my comrades. What do you think of the British fleet, Captain? Turning to me, another asked sneeringly, have they succeeded in making their ships invisible? A small fishing seiner converted into a patrol vessel with 18mm guns mounted on its sides passed us in the channel. It doesn't look much like a line ship, does it? Someone asked mockingly. If there's a fleet like that here, I'll sail for Canada tomorrow. I wonder how you're going to get there. Are you counting on British help? A typical British policeman stood on the quay, alone, without a revolver, without a rifle, without even a baton, and calmly looked at the people on our deck. We did not see a single soldier on the quay, only a small group of natives and dockers taking the moorings. It was not enough to say that we were puzzled. We were stunned. We could have been Germans, after all, someone said. There could be a heavily armed regiment lurking on board, ready to jump ashore and take over the harbour. The remark went unanswered. Half-forgotten phrases from school days came to mind. The British Empire, Britain is lord of the seas, no invader has set foot on British soil for centuries. All this gave the confidence that we were entering a protected harbour. It is characteristic of the English, we decided not to flaunt anything. Instead of the group of officials we had expected, 2 tired men in civilian clothes with small tattered briefcases in their hands came on board. As we later found out, they were immigration officials. We took turns approaching them, checking in and answering questions. Among the Poles on board, I was the only one who spoke English, so I was used as an interpreter. But first I had to answer their questions. After finding out my name, surname, age and where I came from, the officials asked me to show my documents. I did not have any documents. They were left in the pocket of the uniform with which I had covered Stasek's body. The captain of this ship knows me personally. I said in answer to their question, the Polish consulate can confirm my identity. What are you, sir? They asked politely. A civilian, a soldier, or a sailor? A little of all. I can't exactly state my status myself. We'll book you as a civilian. Do you have any luggage? No. What's that? One of them asked, pointing to a machine gun. It's a machine gun, I said proudly. It could come in handy if the Germans attacked us. I have ammunition for it. Do you have the necessary certificate? What? A certificate authorizing you to possess a firearm, he explained patiently. But there's a war on. I've used this machine gun before. Perhaps I shall use it again. I'm sorry, sir, but we can't let you take it ashore. That's how I had to part with the machine gun. I spent several hours with the immigration officials, translating thousands of questions and marvelling at pure English politeness and tact. Then we were all taken to the town cinema, where several English ladies had already prepared milk tea and watercress sandwiches for us. Apparently the food supply in England is really bad if they've already switched to grass, said the man sitting next to me. But we, after a few days of eating only nuts and drinking water, and only occasional tea, were glad to have grass and tea and milk. We spent 2 nights and a day in the cinema while the Englishmen solved the problem of our accommodation. The day passed beautifully. We listened to music and watched a few films. At night, on the other hand, we were seriously uncomfortable. The chairs in the hall were soft, but we could only sit on them. But we wanted to lie down so much. The morning began with music and an invitation to tea. Grunting and groaning, we climbed out of our chairs, kneading our frozen members. We were not allowed to leave the cinema premises as we had not passed the security check. Again there was a queue for the toilet, but the queue for peanuts was no longer here. On the 3rd day of our stay in Falmouth, we were put on a train and taken to London. In London we were bussed to our barracks and to the empty school premises on Fulham Road, where the vetting procedure took place. I was then allowed to make contact with the Polish authorities and naval headquarters. I requested that I be immediately posted to the Polish Army or Navy. The bureaucratic machine was slow to digest the information received, and for several days I was forced to work as an interpreter. I was now part of a group carrying out refugee screening. The leader of this team, a red-haired man, a Scotsman, I learnt, rarely asked questions, but more just followed the slow question and answer process, with the Polish consular official and me as interpreters. Sometimes he would get up from his seat, go to a corner of the room and have a few words with the Englishman sitting there, also a member of the inspection team. Then he would return to his seat and begin to drum his finger on the table, obviously thinking about something else. One day, while the Dutchman was going through the inspection procedure, I started to look through the documents he had taken out of his pockets. The Scotsman seemed to be bored, too, and, as usual, retreated to a corner to talk to his employee. It seemed to me that this time they were not just chatting, but talking about something serious. When the Scotsman invited me to his table at lunchtime, I asked him a question. Do you suspect the Dutchman of something? We don't suspect him of anything. He looked extremely surprised. Then why did you say to detain him? How do you know what I said? I saw you talking in the corner. But you couldn't hear me. You see, I couldn't hear you, but I could read your lips, I explained. I'm a pretty good lip reader, and now I'm practicing speaking English. Well, that's very useful, agreed my companion with a smile. Soon he surprised me. After lunch, while working, he was called to the phone, and through the glass door I could see him talking. He noticed that I was watching him, and when he returned, he called me over. This time he addressed me in clear Polish, with a barely perceptible accent. Are you spying on me again? He asked. Yes, I admitted. Your knowledge of Polish is also very useful, isn't it? We went back to work, and I spent several hours translating questions and answers as if he didn't understand a word of Polish. He even managed to keep an incomprehensible smile on his face. At least the man, apparently annoyed by the questions he was asking, demanded of me, tell this moron to ask intelligent questions. The next morning when I got to work, the Scotsman said, I'm free for today. Tomorrow you are leaving. They're taking you into the Navy, he informed me. We shook hands, and as I was about to leave, the Scotsman's question stopped me on the threshold. What do you know about the Dutchman? Oh, only that my mate doesn't like him. The soprano one? Yeah. She's a good-looking woman. Why doesn't she like him? Hey, she said it was purely intuitive. You know, a woman's intuition. She thought she'd met him in Paris, surrounded by Poles who spoke no language but Polish. What else did she say? She had heard him swear in German when he tripped and fell on deck as we sailed from France to England. She's right. He is German, said the Scotsman, absent-mindedly drawing with a pencil. He's already been taken into custody. How then did you expose him? No. I was watching him and noticed him talking in the courtyard with one of your countrymen. That's not evidence. I agree. But, as you remember, at the interview he said he only spoke Dutch. No. Did you hear him speak Polish? I didn't hear it. I saw it. I'm not only learning Polish now, I'm trying to read lips. We laughed together. Why did you learn to read lips? He asked me. To keep track of my girlfriends. Although I can see it's come in handy. Absolutely, the Scotsman replied, and we shook hands again. The consulate gave me the money, and after hailing a taxi I went to the Polish headquarters, where, after several hours waiting, I was invited to see a very important-looking commander. He quickly got to the heart of the matter. We have granted your request. You are going to the Navy. You will have some difficulties at the first stage, but you are a professional and will quickly get used to it. You will have a group of liaison officers under your command, and you will be assigned to both merchant and military vessels as needed. Your knowledge of English will come in handy in communicating with the British Admiralty. The Levant will be your first vessel. She is now moored at Plymouth. You are to board her tomorrow and sail for Canada the same day. Any questions? Yes, sir. I don't have any clothes, just what I'm wearing. Lieutenant Winnicky will take care of it. Good luck, Lieutenant. I haven't had time to look round London. I had about 2 hours left after Winnicky had provided me with everything I needed, but I still had to adjust my uniform and buy a few little things. Before I left for Plymouth, I sent Galena a bouquet of flowers. She was staying at Falmouth. Then I bought newspapers and magazines and got on the train. I knew that Plymouth was home to a British naval base. I arrived in Plymouth after midnight. I needed to contact the Polish or British Naval Command to find out how to get to the Levant. My telephone conversations dragged on. As it was explained to me, they had not been notified of my arrival and therefore could not provide me with transport. By the time I finished the conversation, the station was empty, with only 2 conductors still talking on the platform. They explained to me how to get to the naval base, and I decided to walk there. In the darkness, I quickly got lost, and after wandering the streets senselessly, I had to give up my search. That's strange, I thought as I walked through the streets. Plymouth has a naval base, and the Germans are surely going to invade. There should be patrols going round the city, checking all the streets and nooks and crannies. Where the hell are they? I've been wandering round the city for over an hour and haven't met a single living soul. Could it be that there were thousands of eyes watching me from camouflage bunkers with their finger on the trigger, ready to fire at any second? If that's the case, and it should be, some tense hand could have accidentally pulled the trigger and shot me. After all, a town like Plymouth is bound to defend itself. I tried to find some sort of hotel, but the search was completely fruitless. When I saw a car in the street, I raised my hand, hoping it would stop. The driver must have noticed me at the last moment. The car swerved, and he swore at me and drove on. What to do? I decided it was stupid to hang around the streets until someone shot me. So I found nothing better to do than to go to the intersection of a few streets, sat down in the middle of the intersection on a suitcase so that a passing patrol would realize that I was alone and unarmed. About half an hour passed, and I heard deliberately slow footsteps and then saw a policeman emerge from the darkness. Whoa, who's there? I called out, making my presence known. The policeman came up and shone his torch in my face. What's the matter, sir? Are you tired? Tired as hell. I've been trying for hours to find someone to show me the way to the harbour. Where the hell is everybody? They must be asleep. There's a war going on, I began hotly, and no doubt... No. Of course, sir, but even the Germans sleep sometimes. What can I do for you? Asking me for my papers, he scrutinized them carefully and handed them back. Could you take me to the hotel so that I could wait there until morning? It's too late, sir. All the inns are closed. But if you come with me to the station, we can work something. At the police station, everyone was very attentive to me. They tried calling various military departments, but unfortunately to no avail. I'm sorry, sir, but all the officers must be fast asleep. You'll have to wait until morning. Isn't there a hotel nearby? Hey, at this time of night, sir, they won't let you into any hotel. If you don't mind, you could sleep in one of our cells at the station. You'll be quite comfortable there. I've had to spend the night in prison more than once on my way from Poland to France. I see no reason why I shouldn't add an English prison to my collection. No, don't worry, sir, we won't lock the cell. They assured me, handing me a huge cup of tea with milk. But one question kept bothering me, and before I went to my cell, I decided to ask the policeman. Why didn't any of the soldiers come out to talk to me? They must have seen that I was lost in the city. What soldiers are you talking about, sir? Don't they have patrols in the city? Why? The policeman asked in unconcealed astonishment. Aren't you afraid of an invasion? The Germans are already in France. No, it's not as bad as it seems. Even Hitler would be smart enough not to take such action, they assured me. I went to my cell, admiring the British equanimity, although I questioned their overconfidence. In the morning the sergeant met me with a hot breakfast and a large cup of tea and milk. At 9 o'clock I was taken by car to the harbour and taken in a police boat directly to the Levant, anchored in the fjord. This ended the night I had spent in an English prison. A new phase of life was beginning, the war at sea. This war was sharply different from the one with which I had already been acquainted. At sea, the enemy always remains a gift and quite rare. Men dealing with bombs, torpedoes and depth bombs sow death, but very rarely come face to face with the enemy. For them, the enemy is associated with a glimpse of the battle deckhouse of an enemy submarine, the faint outline of a pocket battleship on the horizon, the silhouette of a Focke-Wulf in the dazzling sunlight, or against the grey winter sky over the Atlantic. They do not look into the face of the enemy, do not see the hatred, fear, or courage written on it, do not hear his victory and death cries. The enemy signalled his presence by tearing our ships with torpedoes, blowing them up with shells and bombs, turning into a shapeless mass of red-hot metal, human flesh and blood spreading on the deck. We repaid the enemy in the same coin. But how different was this war from the one I had already faced? Here I did not have to look into the face of the enemy, pursue him silently, stab him, shoot him at point-blank range, and see the bullets make neat holes in his uniform and enter his body and topple him over. One did not have to squeeze the throat of an enemy until he collapsed and fell to the ground. The battles in the Atlantic represented a very different kind of warfare. Within a few years they took the lives of tens of thousands of men, among them my closest friends. Sea battles were fought in the southern seas in tropical heat, and in the northern seas when ships looked little different from icebergs, under the mysterious light of the northern aurora borealis. For many years, winter and summer, doldrums and storms, the Atlantic Ocean was my only home. Often it could be my grave.